Amen. This morning I'd like to start by reading to you Judges chapter 3, verses 12 through 31. Judges chapter 3, verses 12 through 31. And I'm going to get my old man glasses here. That's better. We have finished up the story of the story of Othniel. And today we're going to be looking at the story of Ehud and another gentleman named Shamgar. Judges 3, 12 through 31. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites and went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms. And the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. The people of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. And Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. And he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man, and when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, "I have a secret message for you, O king." And he commanded silence, and all his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, "I have a message from God for you." And he rose from his seat, and Ehud reached out with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the hilt went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly. And the dung came out. And Ehud went into the porch and closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. When he had gone, the servants came. And when they saw the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, "Surely he's relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber." And they waited until they were embarrassed. Then, when he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them. And there lay their lord, dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Syria. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, where the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, "Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites, and did not allow anyone to pass over. And they killed at that time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. Not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. After him was Shamgar the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you for your word. Thank you, Lord, that you have given us so much and told us so much in your word about who you are, about who we are, about all that you have required of us. And I ask this morning, Father, that you would help me to communicate not my opinions, not my words, not my thoughts, but Lord, the thing that you intended to communicate through this text, through your word, Lord, what you wanted to share, not me. Lord, I pray that as we look at this, that we would, even though it is some graphic text, that Father, at the end of the day, when we understand it and comprehend it, that we would recognize and delight and enjoy you because of what you've done, Lord. Thank you for giving us your word to be an encouragement and a blessing and a conviction for the maturing of your people today. Amen. On October 7th, 2023, just a few months ago, there's a group of people called Hamas, and they went into Israel. They sent people across the border of Israel, and I will not give any graphic descriptions right now. They killed, they maimed, and they destroyed. They perpetrated great evil. In the next few days, I'm sure many of you guys remember this. It was pretty big on the news for a while. Over the course of the next few days, at first everyone was confused and how and why and what's going on. And as video began to be released, and we saw more and more evidence of what was happening, and realizing that it was Hamas themselves who were releasing these videos, became really evident what was going on. And what was interesting is that there were times, even though these videos were horrible and grotesque, there were people who were absolutely opposed to what Hamas was doing, who was saying, you have to watch them. Don't look away. When these videos are playing, and as they're presented, and as they're shown on television or on the internet, watch them. You have to look. Do not look away at what's happening in Israel. And they did that for a reason. As awful as they were, people were saying, don't look away. Because you need to understand the evil that's happening. It can be very easy to just bury our heads and pretend like nothing's going on and everything's okay. And their encouragement was, don't look away, because you have to understand how vile and horrible and evil this is. Don't pretend that this is okay and pretend that it's not happening. Don't look away from these videos. Now, hopefully you're not showing them to 5-year-olds. But the encouragement was a realistic one. Watch at the evil that's happening. That's kind of what's happening here in the book of Judges. Even as I read that section out loud with children in the room, there's times when you have to say, oh my goodness, is this right? Is this appropriate? And the reality is, much of this book, and increasingly so as we go through, isn't PG anymore. Today's going to be a bit more like PG-10. Pretty soon it's going to be PG-13. By the time we get to the end, it's going to be a full rated R. But we can't look away. We should not look away. It's here for a reason. God placed these horrible things here for a reason. Because there's something that God wants us to understand as we see the gore and the blood and the horror and the evil. So we get to our text today about Ehud. And it's going to begin to escalate just a little bit today. The grunginess of the story. And we see that this story of Ehud, like many of the cycles of the judges, if you remember, there's 7 judges. Some of them follow very consistently the cycle of people sinning, and then after they sin, God brings judgment. And then after they're judged, people cry out, oh, this is uncomfortable, help me. And God gives them a judge, and then they have peace. And many of the cycles follow that pattern. Not every one of them. There's some called minor judges, and we're going to look at one of those today too, Shamgar, just one verse. But this story about Ehud generally follows the same pattern, just like we saw with Othniel last week. So we're going to start into this, and we're going to look at these first 2 sections of the cycle in verses 12 through 14. And we're going to see the sin of Israel and God's judgment that he places on them. I'll read it again. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They sinned. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they'd done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites and went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms. And the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. Now, these first 2 pieces, they sin. God brings other people to come in and to give judgment. This is the same as Othniel last week, and also like Othniel last week, and we talked about this, God seems to be sovereign over all of these pieces. God is the one who enabled Eglon, this king, to come in and to judge Israel. They didn't just decide on their own. Ultimately, over all of these pieces, God is sovereign. And interestingly enough, Eglon himself, much like if, for those of you who were last week, remember that the king last week, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name, it was a crazy name, but it was kind of a play on words, that king's name, right? He was the Dark Lord, the dark, double, evil king was the phrase that really was used for him. Well, Eglon also is a little bit of a play on words. And it's going to be important to what this author is recording and what he's trying to communicate. Eglon is a word, it's a name that should elicit some ideas. And I didn't put it up on the screen, but the word egel is kind of like a calf or a bull. Egol is a round, rotund calf or bull. So the idea that you almost get when you talk about this King Eglon, it sounds very similar to these other two words that sound something like a fattened calf, a fat bull. Right? That's kind of what's going on here. And for any of you who have noticed, right, later on in this verse, one of the funny things about this text is you've got this fat king. Well, that's not just random. There's a reason why he's describing this king this way. Even in his name, he's kind of like this fat bull, this fat king. That's his name. They're making a mockery of this king, by the way. But it has more intention than that, too. And this fat king, this fattened bull, right? He's the king of this place called Moab. And for those of you who may or may not remember some of the details of this, I don't expect you to. I have the advantage of having the whole week to look all this stuff up, so here's some cheat sheets for you. They're descended from Abraham's nephew Lot. And Israel was supposed to leave them alone as they were coming into the land. Right? We've been talking about Joshua and Judges and they're coming in the land. And Israel was supposed to leave these Moabites alone. We saw that in Deuteronomy 29, or Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 9. And this is the same people, for those of you who may remember, this is the same group of people that hired this guy named Balaam and his famous donkey. Right? You guys remember, some of you maybe remember that story. And Balaam and his donkey, they asked him, come curse, right? Come curse the Israelites for us. That was the Moabites. They asked Balaam and his donkey to come curse, and Balaam was not able to do that. And rather than cursing them, he ends up giving this prophecy of one who is going to come. But that's who we're talking about, is this king of the Moabites. And they partner up with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, and they take the city of Palms. Now, again, we don't have it up on the map, but basically the city of Palms is Jericho and sort of the surrounding valley. They call it the city of Palms because it had palm trees around it, probably. But that would be basically the city of Jericho. So God calls this king, right? God in his sovereign authority calls this king of Moab and the Amalekites and the Ammonites, and they come and they reign there for 18 years. They're in charge. And so once again, we come to the second and third parts of these cycles in verses 15 through 18. We read this. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. The people of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. And again, the word here for cry out is the same as it was last time. It's not a term of repentance. They're not crying out because they feel really bad about pursuing other gods. They're crying out because they're uncomfortable and they would like somebody to make them comfortable again. And in his graciousness, God responds. And he provides a deliverer, this time a man named Ehud. And Ehud also has some funny things about his name. And he's got some funny characteristics. He's this left-handed dude. And he's a Benjamite, a left-handed man. Now, one of the funny things even about this idea, right? You miss some of the wordplay as it comes over from the Hebrew into English. So a Benjamite is basically what that means is son of the right hand. Right? So when you figure that out, it becomes this clever little play on words. He's a left-handed son of the right hand. That's who this guy Ehud is. Now, what it means to be left-handed, it's not just that, well, he just uses his left hand more. It has an actually bigger significance than that. Because the term that they use to describe him as being left-handed is not normally what you would use. And it's not just that he's ambidextrous. He was most likely, and you see this later on if anybody ever wanted to look it up, in Judges 20:16, you'll see later on, there's this group of Benjamites and they're warriors. And all of them are left-handed. But what it actually means is that it's a group of people whose right hands are bound. Most likely what's happening is that this is a group of warriors who started off right-handed, but they trained to be left-handed fighters, which would be a huge advantage, right? Your sword is on this side, your shield is on this side, but if all of a sudden you're going against somebody, and we've got some baseball people here too, right? It matters if you're a left-handed or a right-handed pitcher. It gives you some advantages, same thing in war. If all of a sudden you can use a sword or a sling in either hand, you're a force to be reckoned with. And these men trained this way. So this left-handed warrior was trained to be basically ambidextrous. That's the likeliness here. And again, you could see some of those men talked about in Judges 20:16. So it's not just that he happened to be left-handed, which is not that big of a deal, but he was trained to be a left-handed warrior. We don't know all the details about this planning, but we know that this man Ehud, part of his role was that all of these people who've been in submission to this foreign king, Eglon, they decided to send this left-handed warrior over to him in order to pay tribute, which would have been common. Right? The king, Eglon, said, hey, I'm ready for my money. I won the war. Bring me my money. Fatten me up. And so they would bring the money to fatten him up. And they bring a sacrifice to the king. In Judges 3:16 through 25, and Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length, probably somewhere between a foot and a half, about this big, a sword about that long, more like a really short sword or a long knife. And Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. And he presented the tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. How even this sword is set up is important. Clearly, Ehud has a plan. Clearly, right, he's got an idea of what he's going to do. He's specifically designed a weapon to accomplish what he's looking for. This is planned. This is all premeditated. And he makes this short sword and he straps it on his right leg. And that kind of matters too. Because it's this short little sword. It's strapped underneath his clothes. Now, most of the time, if you're a right-handed guy, you're going to have a big sword hanging off your left hand. You pull it out and all that kind of stuff. So when you go up to the king and they're checking you for weapons, they're going to look over for a big sword over here. They're going to check the side. Not many people are going to look for a sword over on this side, just a tiny little thing. So it was a sneaky way to get this material in to see the king. And that's why all of a sudden it kind of matters that he was able to pull it with his left hand and he was able to do all of these things. It all goes towards this plan that Ehud has and how he's going to accomplish this. And it describes, again, Eglon, and it's repeated again, right? First, you kind of see this hint in his name, and now they make it explicit. His name is hinted at being this fat cow, right? Or a fattened calf. But now they make it explicit, and they call him a fat man. He was a very fat man. Now, the term that they use for fat here, and again, this is kind of important and relevant. It's not just that he was obese, but it's the same term that they would oftentimes use for when a cow was fattened up for the sacrifice. Right? As we read through this, one of the images that's going to be repeated, and one of the things that the original readers would have cued off of, and it's a little bit harder for us because it's not quite in the same language, there's a lot of ideas here about sacrifice, right? Eglon is continually being displayed as a little bit of a fool, kind of like in the book of Esther where there were these caricatures of all of these people. That's a little bit what's happening in this story too. It's this heightened caricature of the king. He's sort of a foolish, silly, fattened calf king. And we're going to see that more as we walk through. And they call him a very fat man. He's a man who is a fattened calf ready for slaughter. That's kind of the phraseology that we would hear if we could all read it and we lived in Israel at the time. That's the idea that would be communicated to us, is that this man was a fattened calf ready for slaughter. That's the idea. And then we get to the section where Ehud goes and he approaches this calf fattened and ready for slaughter. And when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he commanded silence, and all his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came to him, and he was sitting alone in the cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he rose from the seat. And Ehud reached with his left hand, took his sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly, and the dung came out. Then Ehud went out to the porch and closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. And when he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, surely he's relieving himself in the closet of the cool chambers. And they waited till they were embarrassed. But when he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them, and their Lord lay dead on the floor. So, if you're like me, it took me a few times reading through this to get all of the story straight. We're going to briefly walk through the story. So here's the idea. So they pay tribute, and then Ehud and his people leave and start to head home. And once they get to what is basically Gilgal, probably the border land between the land that the land that Eglon had conquered and the land that was still under Jewish occupation, if you will. They kind of got to that border, it seems like, and there's these idols there. We're not entirely sure what they are. They could have been actually idols that the Jews were worshiping. They could have been markers that delineated where the land split. We're not 100% certain. But there, our hero, if you want to call him, Ehud, splits from his people and he decides to go back. And he walks back and he gets back to the king Eglon. Now he's alone. He doesn't have his retinue with him anymore. He's by himself, and he comes. And perhaps because these are idols, maybe this was a way for him to say, oh, look, I got this secret message from God while I was there near these idols. And so therefore Eglon was ready to listen. And he gets back, and he tells them, I have a message for you. I've got something I got to tell you. And then he kind of escalates the terminology, and he says, I have a secret word from the Lord for you. This isn't just anything. This is a special thing. And there's a little bit of a wordplay even here, too. This word that he uses for the secret thing, dabar, could be translated either a word or a thing or a matter, right? So you see, it seems like maybe Ehud is playing a little word game where he's trying to tell the king, I have something secret for you. I've got a secret thing to show you. Right? Clearly communicating and expecting the king to think, oh man, it's going to be this message or it's going to be this thing. But his word is ambiguous enough that really what he means, this secret thing that he has for them, is really, it's a knife in his belly. That's what he's got for him from the Lord. And so we see that Ehud sticks this thing in his belly. And out of this comes this gruesome scene. Probably one of the more explicit so far, right? It's one thing when you can hear a story and say, oh yeah, there was a war, lots of people, 10,000 over here died, 10,000 over there died. But you're not sitting there describing people's arms being lost and all of these details. And here we begin, and this book begins to start to describe things in a little bit more gruesome detail. And like I said, this is going to be maybe a little bit more PG-10 than just PG or G today. So do what you will for that. And as we get farther, I'll warn you guys, and we'll get something set up when it starts getting more to PG-13 and R. And we'll have a place for your kiddos to go when we get there. But this becomes a little bit more gruesome. And he begins to describe how Ehud plunges this knife into his belly and dung comes out and the fat encloses it. And he describes it in explicit, repulsive, grotesque terms. Basically, he's humiliated the king. He's humiliated the king and he's humiliated his people by trickery and by deception. And now this king is lying on the ground with his guts and his insides becoming his outsides. I'm going to try and keep it rather somewhat tame here. But it's not a pretty picture. It's a gory picture. It's not something that we would put up on a screen and we would show for family movie night. We wouldn't do that. Because it's grotesque. And this king has been shown to be a bit of an idiot. What fool king has his enemy come in on his own, send all of his people away, and give this guy an opportunity to be alone with the king? And what foolish group of people around him would say, good idea. Let's have this warrior alone with our king, who's probably too fat to get out of the way if he does something. Not a good idea. But we get this picture, the scene that's intended to evoke a picture of sacrifice. We have this king who is being alluded to and described as a fattened cow. A fattened calf ready to be sacrificed. And he's sacrificed under Ehud's special little knife. And it's gross and it's horrible. And the original readers of this would have made this connection as they looked at the name of Ehud and they looked at the name of Eglon and they put all of these pieces together. It would have been reminiscent of the sacrificial system. I had earlier Pastor Mike read, and I'll do that again, a little bit of Leviticus. One of the things that you see in that sacrificial system is it's gory and it's gross. And one of the things that we're going to recognize, and it begins to get more dramatic here as it begins to get a little bit more explicit. And this idea of a sacrifice becomes more and more evident. And the reality is this, and we see this here. This gore and this blood and this bile being spilt everywhere and this stabbing of a fat man with a knife, it is all a consequence of sin. This kind of bloody mess will consistently be associated with the sinful failures of Israel and the nations around them. This is what happens when people rebel. Blood is spilled. Sacrifices are needed to put things back together again. Grotesque sacrifices are needed to put things back together again. This is evident all throughout the Old Testament. This picture of sacrifice and blood as the consequence of rebellion is consistent in the Old and the New Testament. Part of it was almost ritualistic. It was theological in nature. It was part of the cultic, and I don't mean to say like an ancient cult. I mean part of the religious duty of the time to sacrifice. They learned about these things just 1 or 2 generations back. And I'm going to read this again, Leviticus 7, 1 through 5. This is what would happen because of guilt. This is a guilt offering. We messed up, so here's what happens when you mess up. This is what you have to do to have your guilt alleviated. This is the law of the guilt offering, Leviticus 7, 1 through 5. It is most holy. In the place where they kill the burnt offering, they shall kill the guilt offering, and its blood shall be thrown against the side of the altar, and all its fat shall be offered, the fat tail, the fat that covers the entrails, the 2 kidneys with the fat that is on them at the loins, and the long lobe of the liver that he shall remove with the kidneys. The priest shall burn them on the altar as a food offering to the Lord. It is a guilt offering. Over and over and over and over in the Old Testament. If you could just picture for a second what it must be like to be the priests. These were not men walking around in clean white robes, pontificating things next to libraries. These were men who were bathed in blood because this would be a constant sacrificial system, recognizing over and over and over. We mess up, blood ensues. We sin against a holy and pure and perfect God, blood comes. And animals get decimated, and bodies are desecrated and burned for the reparation of sin. That's what happened inside the sacrificial system, inside of the theological system. But it's not just inside of religious systems that this happens. This is real in every element of life. This is realistic everywhere. People rebel against God and they go against His holiness and His righteousness. And what comes from that? Blood and gore and death. We saw that again in October in Israel. For those who seem to delight and rejoice in the horror of the world and the horror of their hatred for other people. And so they tore them apart in unspeakable ways. Sin and vileness caused desecration and blood to flow. We see it in the persecution of believers. There's more believers dying for the name of Christ today than all throughout history. All over in many nations, in North Korea and Indonesia and India and Mexico and all over. Believers still pay in blood. We see it in anger between cultures. We could talk about wars in Russia and Ukraine right now. Blood is being spilled constantly. It's easy sort of on the news, though none of us say we like it. But we're not sitting next to every single mother and brother and child who just lost their family member. When sin happens and when arrogance happens and when pride happens and when people rebel against God, there's bloodshed. We see it in slavery. That is still a thing. In abortion, that happens every day. In abuse of every kind. The destruction of people and the desire to see blood flow is constant. It is a result of sin. And it's not that hard to find it. You don't have to go very far to find it. It also exists in the same judgment of that sin. We see that in Exodus as the Jews were leaving and trying to get out of Egypt. And what did God do in order to bring judgment on the nation of Egypt? He destroyed firstborn children. People paid, and animals paid. We see it in the sacrificial system that we just described in Leviticus. God seems to be trying to communicate something. Don't look away. Don't look away. I'm showing you something. Sin causes blood to flow. Don't look away. He's making a point. He made that point as Israel was coming in and getting rid of the Canaanites because of the evil that they were perpetrating. It needed to be done. They needed to be stopped slaughtering their own children and worshiping these horrible other gods. And so God used Israel to judge them, and there was blood that flowed in judgment. And even at the end of the day, and we could talk about this all being Old Testament, but blood flows for judgment still and will. Revelation 14, 17 through 20, at the very end, when God comes down and He says, judgment is going to come, He's going to send His judge, and really He's talking about His Son Jesus. And look at the way that this is described. And half of you are probably halfway through it already on the screen, but I'm going to read it. In Revelation 14, 17 through 20, then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar. And the angel has authority over fire, and he called out with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. It's ready to be sacrificed. So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and the blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. Now, I'm not saying this is all literal. I don't think there's going to be an actual winepress, but there's a picture. There's an imagery that is set up. The natural consequence of the fallenness and the evilness when people strive to rebel against God and they strive to embrace what the world is calling them to do, what Satan is calling them to do. When we strive to embrace rebellion against God, here's what comes: blood, desecration, stories about men being stabbed in the stomach and their fat covering over it, and dung being spread everywhere. Don't look away. It's not fun to talk about. It's kind of weird to preach on. But don't look away. We can't. This text is here for a reason. In the end, our sin purchases our death, blood, and desecration. This is the reason why God sent his son, Jesus. And this is why Jesus died like he died. Because here's the problem: when we recognize the holiness and the purity and the perfection of our God, there is no amount of blood that can be pulled from humanity that will cover our rebellion against our God. We don't have enough. Even if every drop was drained from our bodies, there's not enough to cover our rebellion. And so he sent his son to cover it for us. And even this is a gruesome tale. Don't look away. We know that it was a bloody price that was paid for us too. John 19:1-3 talks about this as we see this imagery again of a sacrifice. And I really believe that this is the idea that is intended to be evoked. Now, in these original readers, did they understand the future element of Jesus yet? They didn't. They didn't know that yet. But they knew about the sacrificial system. And they knew some of the connections. They understood as Jews that Eglon was being pictured as a sacrifice. Something was dying, and the stories of all of these people being killed, they knew that there was some connection here. We have the blessing of the New Testament, and we see the completion of the story. They didn't have it all, but we do. And we know that all of this blood was ultimately spilled. John 19:1-3 begins to talk about some of the gruesomeness and we're going to see this gruesomeness expand throughout the book of Judges as we recognize more deeply the consequence of sin. Pilate took Jesus, John 19:1-3, Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together the crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they struck him with his hands. I'm not going to read all the distinct verses, but for many of you guys who know, they hung him on this cross where he probably suffocated. They took a whip with leather strips and bone and metal. So they have this whip, and maybe some of you guys have seen this in various images, but it was a whip and it had 5 or 6 strands on it, and at the end of those strands would be pieces of metal or bone or something sharp, and they would rip it across his back 40 times. Or 50. You have to forgive me. I don't remember the exact number. And you know what happens at the end of that? By the time they're done, basically Jesus' back was laid open. It was shredded. And then they hung him on a cross to suffocate. And they put a crown of thorns where these big spikes, and they shoved it into his head. This is not a pretty picture. But we can't look away. We have to see. We have to watch. Because only then can we truly understand, when we recognize what our sin and what the rebellion of the people of Israel. See, they started this. Back at the beginning, the reason this foreign king was even there was because these people were prostituting themselves to other gods. They were chasing other people. They were chasing the culture instead of their king. That's what caused this bloodshed. It's their own rebellion, their own heartlessness, their own desire to love the world more than to love God. And that's why we needed Jesus, because we couldn't pay for it with our own blood. And so he came and he paid for it for us. And so when we realize how deeply we've offended God, and the consequence and the cost of that, and how grotesque it is, and then to realize that God sent his Son to pay that grotesque, deeply offensive, terribly awful payment so that you and I, we don't have to. That's the picture that we should be having, even as we're thinking about this King Eglon. That's the imagery that's being invoked when we think about him and this fattened calf ready to be sacrificed. But even after Ehud took care of his business and he put his knife through this king's belly, and what they found was this grotesque body on the floor, it wasn't over yet. There's more blood to be spilled. It's not described quite as detailed, but there was more to be spilled. Judges chapter 3, verses 26 through 30, Ehud escaped while they delayed. And he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Sarah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. Then the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, "Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites and did not allow anyone to pass over. And they killed at that time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. Not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. They got rest. They had peace. But there was a price. There was a cost. Now, 10,000 is probably a bit figurative. I doubt it was exactly 10,000 men. It might have represented certain, numbers of legions or things like that. But at the end of the day, here's the deal. For Israel to have peace and rest, every single Moabite man had to be slaughtered. Not a single one was left. All of them were destroyed. Now, it's not as in much detail as we get with King Ehud and the graphicness, but the scale is huge. It's a huge scale. They wiped out an entire army. For them to have peace, the blood had to flow. Again, it is the same way with Christ. For us to have peace, blood had to flow. And it doesn't stop even here with the story of Ehud. We go in and we say something similar. In the story of Shamgar, it's not really any different. After him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. And he also saved Israel. We don't know a lot about him. He probably wasn't an Israelite, this idea. He's probably an Egyptian. Maybe Anath was a town or a military unit. We don't know a lot about this guy. He had an ox goad, which was probably some kind of spike with a metal tip on it. And we know that he killed 600 men. 600 more deaths were required to bring freedom to Israel. Just like Ehud, just like Othniel, just like in all the introduction to the book of Judges, the constant cost of peace is blood. That is the nature of this fallen world. It's not right. It's not how it's supposed to be. And it will not remain this way. Because God will pay for it. He has paid for it through His Son. And one day it will be fixed. It's not easy for us to talk to people about this. Frankly, it's not easy to preach like this. It's so much easier for us when we share the gospel and when we talk about our Savior and when we talk about the Bible. We don't often refer people straight thing. Hey, what should I read to learn about the Bible? Let me tell you about this guy Ehud and his stabbing of the fat man. That's not usually step one for us. Right? It's not. It's not palatable. It's not appropriate. It's not culturally nice. But it is absolutely necessary. It is absolutely necessary. If we are going to share the gospel of Jesus Christ, this idea that Ehud is making, this idea that the communicator, the original author, he's writing to these southern kingdoms and he's telling them, and he's making these pictures of the sacrifice. He's illustrating this idea. Suffering and death comes. And at that time, he was warning the two southern kingdoms, the Benjamites and Judah, don't do this stuff. Don't do this. Don't be like the northern kingdom. Don't keep sinning. Because here's what happens when you keep sinning. Death and blood come. But you know what they did? They kept sinning. And you know what came? Death and blood. Over and over and over again. It's the natural way of a fallen world. Not a renewed world that God's created, but a fallen one. We just recently went through this. James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15 tells us this. Let no one say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and He Himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. This is how it works. That's what James is saying. If we pursue these things that are against God, here's the natural consequence. We're all going to die. And we will all die. But the question is that going to be an ultimate and final death? Because we're in broken bodies, and we're always in broken bodies, and our bodies are already busted up because we live in a sinful, fallen world. People get hit with baseballs, and their feet break, and we have diseases, and we could go through, I think everybody could raise their hand and list all of the ways that our bodies are broken because we live in a fallen world. And we like to pretend that stuff doesn't exist. That's not how we share the gospel. But the reality is, just like on October 10th, 8th, I don't remember, what we have to do, if we're going to honestly share the gospel, we have to tell people, you can't look away. Do we need to tell people, hey, Jesus loves you, and He has a good plan for your life? Is that true? Yeah, that's true. That's not even close to all of it. It's not sufficient. We have to understand the holiness and the perfections and the goodness of God. We have to understand that there is nothing evil that can come before Him. And the unfortunate fact is, we're full of it. And we can't even understand the beauty and the graciousness and the goodness of God until we understand how filthy we are before Him. And only when we understand how far we have fallen and how desperate we are, can we understand how significant it was that He sent His Son to go and pay that price for us. We cannot look away. If we want to share the gospel, if we want to understand the book of Judges, if we want to understand what God is doing through the rest of these stories that are going to get more graphic, not less. They're not going to get easier, they're going to get harder. But we have to understand as we walk through this book that we cannot look away. We have to acknowledge and understand and embrace the cost of sin. We have to understand that it costs blood and death and desecration, and only then can we understand how beautiful Christ was and what he did for us. And there's a few ways that we symbolize this in a few different ways. Many times we don't think about it. I think, how many can I count right now? But I can find about 5 of them. Right? We got a big old cross over here. I think I at least see 2 or 3 crosses around some necks. Right? Do we even know? Like, that's actually what we're talking about. Every single cross that we see, that is an instrument of torture that we hang around our necks and we put up on our walls. We make some pretty fancy ones. And I'm not saying don't hang them. I'm not saying don't put them up. But we have to acknowledge, right, just like the story of Ehud, every single cross that we hang up is a reminder of the cost and the blood that had to be spilled for our sin. That's what they are. It's a picture of the sacrifice that was needed and the horror that came because of what we've done. And we have another one, and we're going to do this here in a few minutes. Another symbol, another picture is communion. And we do it, and we take communion. And I'm going to have my wife actually, Logan, come up because I was going for 45 minutes, and I'm pretty sure I can move past that today. But another symbol that we partake in as a church is we share communion. And the picture is this, right? Jesus, as he was in the upper room, he was explaining to them. They didn't even understand this yet. But he was sharing his body and his blood with them. That's everything that we've been talking about. Jesus knew that he was about to pay with his life and his blood. He knew he was about to go through probably the most intense suffering that he had ever had to do on earth. He knew it was going to be gory and gross and an uncomfortable thing. And so he invited his disciples to do this really weird thing. To drink the wine as if they were drinking his own blood. And to take the cracker and bread and eat it as if it was his very own body. And thereby symbolizing that through Christ's blood and through Christ's body, the payment is made so we don't have to. So when you go through the book and the story of Ehud, and you say, this is gross, don't just giggle about it and say, wow, fat dude, that's kind of funny. Recognize that this is a picture of what's coming and a picture of what we need. So, I'm going to pause, and while they're playing, if you would like to join with me in what is really, not to scare anybody off of this, but it's a grotesque symbol. And it's supposed to be. I would encourage you again, don't look away. That's the point. It is to remind us that something awful had to happen. And Christ paid it, so we didn't have to. So, while they're playing, if you'd like to, if you would like, you don't have to be a member of our church. All we ask is that you're a believer in Jesus Christ and that you are his. And if that is the case, come on up and come take a piece of bread and come take the cup and then go ahead and have a seat, and I'll walk us through the rest.